Welcome to Stanford Legal, where we look at the cases, questions, conflicts, and legal stories that affect us all every day. I'm Pam Karlan, along with Joe Bankman. Hi, Joe.
Hi, Pam.
So I was recently reading a story in the Washington Post about some census data that suggests that by 2040, as Americans continue to migrate towards particular cities and particular areas surrounding those cities, 16 states are going to account for about 70% of the U.S. population, and 8 states are going to account for half the U.S. population. And that's kind of amazing when you think about 50 states and when you think about things like the Senate and the like. And our show today is going to be what's happening to the people who live in the places that are being moved out of by so many people.
That's right, and we've got the perfect guest for that. It's our colleague and friend, Michelle Wilde Anderson, who's a scholar of state and local government. During the Great Recession, Michelle started looking at cities that actually went into bankruptcy and how that works. We think of Detroit in that category. And in more recent years, she's been traveling around the country to the Rust Belt and other cities we might think of as dying cities and dying rural areas to see what, in fact, they're doing and what hopes for renewal there are. Her forthcoming book, The Fight to Save the City, is about these places. It'll be published next year by Simon & Schuster, so put that on your tickler list for friends for Christmas. Michelle, in this book, you're going to talk about these struggling places. Can you give us a picture of them?
Yeah, there are too many places in the country right now that are just broke. And what I mean by that is that they continue to provide K-12 because, as we all know, schools are legally obligated to be open and to provide a public education. But beyond that, we don't have any things that local governments really must do. And so their default position is they begin to focus exclusively on police and fire and a sort of minimal set of those. And then things like emergency public works, the exploding water main geyser in the middle of the street. And beyond that, they've stopped doing the things that were really about kind of wraparound services for kids, summer programs, the kinds of things that gave people social mobility, a good quality of life, even when they couldn't pay for it out of pocket.
And how did we get to this position? I mean, how did we move from a time when there were after-school programs and parks and cultural events and the like to the kind of cities and you've also written about the areas like right outside of cities. How did we get to that position?
We got there. I mean, that's what's amazing about this point in history where we are. We're now really, depending on the exact region of the country, 40 to even 60 years after the retraction of so many industrial jobs and the automation of layers of jobs across the country. So we've shriveled individual paychecks. Then we're also just decades after the 1970s anti-tax revolution swept the country and then shriveled the local government. War chest for big ticket infrastructure, the kind of investment that we needed to catch up with modernity and to catch up with just the need for wastewater treatment and basics. And then in addition to that, we have allowed this kind of increasing polarization in which we have these, places that are so expensive to live, but where it's easier to get a job, and then places where it's hard to get a job, but it is actually much cheaper to live. And that split in the country is hitting the middle class and the working class very, very hard.
And are we kind of coming to the end of the useful life of the last kind of massive public works thing? We had all these public works from the Great Depression. That's when the bridges and the parks and the like were built. I always think of New Orleans, and the WPA built a hill in the city because it's all below sea level so that the kids of New Orleans could see what a hill looked like.
Yeah, it's not – that's exactly right. There have been 3 huge waves, 3 big generations of taxpayer investment in American infrastructure and public works. There's the Great Depression era and sort of the first industrial city. Then there's the post-war expansion of the suburbs. And then there's the 1970s, the clean water era. And all of those eras are eventually going going to kick the bucket. They can't last forever. And it was our turn to really step up and really reinvest and expand and modernize American infrastructure 20 years ago. And here we are. And those older systems, Flint was that first generation of infrastructure failing. The outer suburbs of Atlanta are that sort of second generation failing. And the inner areas of California are that third generation failing.
When you pick up on Flint, of course, what we're thinking of is what happens when you don't invest in infrastructure, what happens in particular on those cities that have been left behind. So they're going to find it harder to do that on their own. I know you've been traveling to these areas. Could you take us to one of them?
Sure. I have been to Flint. It was heartbreaking and inspiring, but I'm going to take you to Stockton instead, because here we are in California. We're so close to Stockton. And I think about Stockton, and I write about it this way in the book, as a city of ancestors and a city of orphans. And what I mean by that is that Stockton, like so many of these cities, is just this incredible map of the world. It has bloodlines that just trace out to the whole world, sort of corridors of immigration into the country and to the American South coming to California and so forth. So it has this proud, gritty, working class history that's been really important to California agriculture and California industry and the Western military. But meanwhile, it's a city of orphans, too. And I mean that because of homicide. I mean that because of prisons. And I mean that because of commute time. So homicide because it has suffered terribly under the rate of shootings and drug-related transportation as it's moved from being a hub to transport everything from tomatoes to asparagus around the country to being a major corridor for drug trafficking. Incarceration, as we've answered American poverty and falling wages with nothing more than police and prisons. And then these brutal commute times to very low wage employment all over California, because to get a job of any kind in a city like Stockton now realistically means moving yourself 2 to 4 to 5 hours a day to reach employment.
So to what extent is this the fault somehow of Stockton versus the fault of forces way outside of Stockton's boundaries? I mean, who bears the responsibility for this, and where were the decisions that made things go wrong? Where were they made? When were they made?
Yeah, I mean, in any given city, you can find examples of mismanagement, missed opportunities, or just run-of-the-mill human mistake, and Stockton includes some of those. But much more importantly, these cities are just in the line of fire of these enormous changes. The 21st century knowledge economy has favored cities that are right in the heart of a huge expansionist research empire with a lot of modern engineering and computer science innovation. And so Stockton, that's why Stockton even has the chance of being able to commute to this Silicon Valley corridor of jobs that we're in right now. And then the automation waves that have flown out of these laboratories have sacrificed a lot of jobs. The anti-tax revolution means that even just to quote unquote pull up your bootstraps in a place that is really facing chronic shortages of revenues, you have to clear majority and supermajority voting approval requirements. And we've just loaded up our state constitutions with those kinds of barriers.
This is Stanford Legal, and today we're talking with our colleague Michelle Wilde Anderson about the cities that are being left behind.
You know, Michelle, I love the phrase, though it's so striking and sad, a city of orphans, because I think of what it's like for someone growing up there, and you might have one parent or grandparents that have been victims of our opioid crisis or incarceration. And so then the hardworking other parent gets a job, but her job is hours away. So by the time she leaves in the morning, by the time you get up, makes you a lunch, and then sees you right before bed, and you're an orphan in that way as well.
That's right. I had a young man come to speak to my students at Stanford recently who described never seeing his dad across his childhood. His dad was working low-wage jobs and multiple jobs across this just huge region of Northern California. So he wouldn't see his dad for days on end. His mom was working her butt off. And, and then a kid like that looks at their parents and they not only have immense needs of child development that their parents can't meet despite their heroic best efforts, but they also look around and they say, is that the future that I want? And that young man had taken 2 bullets by the time he was 18. And so now he's an incredible youth organizer. He's part of this just inspiring social movement in Stockton, one of the fiercest social justice advocacy communities you could find. But he's he's come up against terrible odds, and that's true for so many places across the country.
So we don't want to get into, I think, what you called dying cities porn. But
ruin porn,
excuse me. But it's a tough spot to be in. There's a lot of gangs in Stockton, and that's a kind of peer support that you're going to get in the absence of the adults who are working jobs day and night and feel helpless themselves. How does Stockton compare to the other cities you've looked at, like Detroit?
I mean, Detroit and Stockton are similar in that respect, but they're also similar to rural, deeply anti-government, pro-Trump rural enclaves that are going through some of these same challenges. I think the Trump election has obscured how much common ground there is across these dying places that Pam opened with. There are so many places that are sort of retracting across the country, and Trump makes us think that this is a white phenomenon or it's a rural phenomenon or it's a Republican phenomenon. It's not. I think he could have had a national landslide election if he hadn't been so dismissive and racist about the diversity of the American post-industrial working class.
I mean, one of the things that's striking here is, when you were talking about Stockton or in the work you've done on rural Oregon, these are areas where there were extractive industries or agriculture, which are things that really can't be sent someplace else. And yet they seem to be having these huge problems. So it's not just manufacturing has moved overseas, which I guess is in some sense the Detroit problem, but it's agricultural jobs or extractive industry jobs as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely true. I think that for the extractive industries, so much of this is a story of automation, too. I was actually reading my niece a kid's book from 1970. It was called The Truck Book. It was like the mom's childhood book. And you open to this page, and it has logging trucks that could have come straight out of Southern Oregon, logging trucks that it brags have been fully automated. And the caption says, "This truck can now do the work of 5 men." And I thought that sums it up. But there's also global shipping lines for timber that run from Russia to Argentina to Japan. And so there is a larger story of competition that bears down on extractive industries.
This is Stanford Legal, and today we're talking with our guest, Michelle Wilde Anderson, about the places that have been left behind in the recent American economy. Joe?
One of the things that happens when we talk about it is there are some winners, but some of the winners they're different groups. Some of them are offshore, so the standard of living of someone in China may have gone up, but that doesn't help someone in Flint whose standard of living has decreased. Other winners are in these mega cities where people are moving to. A lot of economists say, well, we have a solution. Move to the cities.
So 2 things. So first of all, this argument that China and India's poverty rates have come down, and so that's sort of part of the cost of progress, one of the great winners in global reorganization. And I celebrate that reduced poverty, but here I get to be a tax person like you, Joe, and say, as a political community, we don't have the capacity to redistribute to China. We are a political community here. Our tax system is internal to the United States. So questions of redistribution are about us. It's about whether we take responsibility for our own poverty. And so if we shift winners overseas and we take on quote unquote losers, although I don't like that term, here, then we're responsible for those on our soil. And even internally to the country, as we shift population, we have to really think about not only moral and ethical responsibility, but just as a practical matter, what it would mean to allow, which is what we're in, a mass internal migration toward the epicenters of climate change, which is what we're doing right now. We are relocating our population away from the Great Lakes region toward the northeast cities on the coast, toward the drought and fire belt that we're in right now, and toward the Gulf Coast that threatens to be completely underwater in most of Florida by 2050. And from a fiscal point of view, that doesn't make any sense. And from a humanitarian and political point of view, I think we heard it loud and clear in November of 2016 that not every single-family homeowner in Pennsylvania wants to live as a tenant in a plywood box house on a Houston floodplain.
One of the things that I think you've talked about this, and I just found it so striking, is you said we should stop calling it the Rust Belt and start calling it the Freshwater Belt. Can you explain a little bit how both that language came to be what it is and what you mean by thinking about this in terms of climate change?
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting to look at urban history and how all of our major historical cities grew up along freshwater. And then the Southwest and the South stopped obeying that principle because, technology and infrastructure allowed us to settle Phoenix and they allowed us to settle all across the Southwest. But eventually they run dry, and Las Vegas is at that, outer edge of its ability to provide for its water needs right now.
To sound like it might be our Cape Town.
Well, absolutely. We better be paying close attention to Cape Town sitting right here. And people talk so much about increasing densification of Silicon Valley, meaning more housing, more people here. I celebrate that. I'm fiercely libertarian when it comes to density. But I think we have to be realistic about the cost of servicing a population in this area with clean water. And we're talking about desal and the cost of energy of desalinating the ocean, which we can probably get away with here. Las Vegas, not so much.
But let me challenge you on this just a bit to try to channel a conservative economist. And they might say, look, property values should impound that. If you're right that this is a foolish place to live, then property values ought to be falling but people are putting their money where their mouth is, or whatever that phrase is. They're just bidding up the property values. So the market must be saying, we believe in Silicon Valley, for example.
The market is definitely saying we believe in Silicon Valley in terms of the present, but markets don't have a reputation for sort of long-term foresight. And one of the problems right now, I think, is that, you look at this in Miami Beach and some of the places that still have overheated condo markets right on the perimeter of the rising sea levels, and it makes no fiscal sense if you're thinking longer than 10 years. But here we are.
And what I'm thinking, in addition to, thank you, Michelle, in addition to that, is the market is externalizing some costs. So when we say the market is paying for it, they're paying for it, but maybe thinking that everybody else is going to be chipping in for the seawalls.
Yeah, the landowner developer gets out of there the second they sell off that condo, and they've externalized all of the costs of that development to Florida, a state with no income taxes and no actual fiscal capacity to deal with what are already, to this day, sinkholes in their streets because their water level is becoming a very present infrastructure.
Yeah, we have friends who live in Miami Beach who say they're going to have to die in their house because now everybody understands where these folks live. You can't sell your house because no one will buy it who thinks they're going to have to live in it 25 years from now. If you're my age, you don't have to worry so much about that, so you can stay in the house.
And that's the exact flip. That's what's so amazing. That's the exact flip of what we could think of as kind of the stylized, like suburban Pennsylvania homeowner right now who has if we're talking about a contracting region of Pennsylvania, for instance, the inner ring wing of Pittsburgh, the Mon Valley, areas like that, their homes are basically worthless, which constrains the mobility of people. They can't just move the way the economists want them to do because they have a house that may be indebted, but also they just can't sell it. So they have to trade down the land tenure and they have to become a tenant and basically start over. And I think what Trump did is he went to these places and he said, you don't have to move. You can stay here and we'll bring the jobs back to you.
We'll be back with more from our guest, Michelle Wilde Anderson, talking about the places left behind next on Stanford Legal on Sirius XM Insight 121.